I want to welcome everyone who is watching live and who will watch it this live later. Tonight we're going to be going over Daniel 8 and basically the vision of the ram and the he-goat. And so we're going to dive right in here in just a minute. A lot of this information is going to be duplicate from Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, but then we're going to get into a section that comes in this vision that's explained by Gabriel himself that we haven't actually touched very much at all. So let's go ahead and open with a word of prayer and dive right in. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the insight that you have given to us, and we thank you for all that you are doing. Lord, we're just asking, open our hearts, open our minds for the things of the kingdom. In Jesus' name, amen. So in Daniel 8, it starts out, it says, in the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. And so similar to the last vision that he had, which was in Daniel 7, that was his first vision. And as we talked about last time, Daniel 1 is written in Hebrew. Daniel 2 through Daniel 7 are written in Aramaic. And starting in Daniel 8, this is written in Hebrew again, and the rest is going to be written in Hebrew. So it's very interesting. Daniel 1 is in particular addresses the things of the Jews. Starting at Daniel 2 through Daniel 7, it has a perspective for the Gentile world. And then starting in Daniel 8, it narrows the focus again on those things that are going to specifically affect the Hebrews. And so that's the reason why we switch from Hebrew to Aramaic back to Hebrew again. And so the focus is going to narrow, and it's going to be about the things of that directly affect the Hebrews. And so we're going to see some of those effects. But this says in the third year of Belshazzar, and if you remember, we talked about the first year of Belshazzar was in 553 BC. Nebuchadnezzar, the last king of Babylon, came on the scene in 556. He turns it over to his son Belshazzar in 553. And in 553, the first year of Belshazzar is when Daniel has his first vision. The second vision is going to be in 553. So it's still several years before Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar are overthrown. The kingdom of Babylon is overthrown. They're overthrown in 539. But this is very specific into the two parts of the statue, or the two different beasts, specifically the second and the third parts of the statue, the second and the third beast. And now it's has another symbolism that is talked about, which is a ram and a goat. And so we'll just dive right in. Verse 2, it says, in the vision, and it so happened while I was looking that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. Now what's interesting, we know Daniel is in Babylon. And so what's interesting, similar to like what happened to Ezekiel, Ezekiel was actually transported in his vision to a different location. And so when we're looking at this and it says that he is in Shushan, this is the same city as Susa. And Susa is or would become the capital of Persia. So we're talking that it's some 150 miles from where Daniel is physically located. And so we don't know if he's transported physically or just in the spirit, but he is taken and transported to the place of Susa. And so and Susa becomes a very important city in the Persian Empire. It becomes the capital city. It's the place where Esther is recorded. It's the place where Nehemiah was, and it becomes a very influential city during the Persian Empire. And so it's very interesting. Daniel physically is in Babylon. We know that he's in Babylon, but he is transported. And there would have been no way that Daniel would have been able to go to Susa, because this is during the period of time that the Persian Empire is actually starting to gain an influence. They've already started raising up, especially the Median Empire has already started raising up. And so Susa is deep into the Persian Empire, where they're actually starting to gain power, and he'd have to actually have traveled through the Median Empire to even get there. And so that's why we're saying that it's by the Holy Spirit that he is transported, and he finds himself in Shushan. And so it's sometimes the names can be confusing, but Susa was renamed multiple times. Shushan is one of the older names for Susa, and so is the province of Elam. Province of Elam is what it was known as during the Babylonian Empire, but it wasn't known as that during the Persian Empire. So anyway, so it says, "Then I lifted my eyes and I saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram, which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other. And the higher one came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand. But he did according to his will and became great." So as we were talking, this relates to the silver part or the chest of the statue, but specifically the previous vision that Daniel had 2 years prior. This would relate to the beast that appeared like a bear. And if you remember the bear was kind of lopsided with one side higher than the other. And so it's interesting that this, and we'll hear it when Gabriel starts interpreting this, he names it by name. And that's the only reason why we know that these specifically relate to this. And then we have worked backwards to the other visions that we're having, the dream by Nebuchadnezzar, the previous vision that Daniel had, that we relate them to the Medes and the Persians. So the Median Empire, it arose first. It came on the scene first, and it rose very quickly in power. However, as we talked about before, Cyrus came in, and his dad was Persian, his mom was Median, and he marries a Median, and so his father-in-law is the king of the Medes. And if you remember that Cyrus, he, through the dissatisfaction of one of his generals, of one of the Median generals, basically takes over the Median Empire without any fight. However, it's the Median Empire that had already started doing conquests. It rose first, even in the middle of the Babylonian Empire. It started rising in power, and then Cyrus raises in power, and he takes over both the Medes and the Persians, and unites the empire under Cyrus. And so when we're considering this and looking at this, it models exactly what happened, is that the Medes rose first, followed by the Persian Empire, and the Persian Empire rose greater. And if you remember, we talked about that when we talked about the beast that looked like the bear, and that the side that was raised up would have been the Persian Empire, just like this one. And so, and basically it's also very interesting that it says that they push westward, northward, southward, in those three directions. And so it's very, very interesting. We also talked about the three ribs that were in the bear's mouth, and when establishing the Persian Empire, or the Medo-Persian Empire. And it's very interesting. These are the directions that they went in order to establish the Persian Empire. And so first they go west from where they are. And as we talked about before, they conquered the Lydian Empire first, which was in the Turkey area. And then next they conquer Babylon. And then lastly, they conquer Egypt, which is going west, going north, going south. And so it's very interesting that in this vision, we're talking several years before the very first campaign happened. And if I need to look back at my notes, the first campaign happens in 546. And so that is yet to come, because this is 551. So another 5 years from now would be when the Persian Empire begins pushing west and starts conquering in that area, and actually gave the ability, as they push west, they conquered a lot of the area of the Euphrates before they pushed north and actually conquer the Babylonian Empire. And so then in verse 5 it says, "And as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Then he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, broke his two horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him. And he was cast down to the ground and trampled him. And there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand." So as we're looking at this, as we're moving through, if you remember, we talked about several kings. The very first king was Cyrus. And so as King Cyrus, which is the greater horn, rises, he actually expands the territory pretty much to the furthest extents that the Persian Empire could go. However, during Xerxes' reign, so you have Darius the first, and remember Darius is a title. He takes it just a little bit more westward, but Xerxes, and when we talk about Xerxes in Esther, he's known as Ahasuerus. It's the same person. So we hear just the story of how Esther interfaces with Xerxes. But in the historical record, Xerxes set his sights on Turkey and Greece. Specifically, he starts attacking Greece. He takes 300,000 soldiers in to try to conquer Greece. And what Greece, it was actually Philip of Macedon who was the king of that area at the time. He didn't do very much. He actually held back his troops until Xerxes had committed himself. And then once Xerxes had committed all of his troops in, Philip of Macedon attacks, and he resists him and defeats Xerxes soundly. And so Xerxes tries one more time to try to make inroads into Greece, and he's soundly defeated again. In fact, he comes in this time. He's like, "I'll come via ship," and he takes 35,000 ships, and the ships are destroyed. And so it's very soundly defeated, and that begins the true decline of the Persian Empire. And but when he came with the 300,000 troops into Greece, what it instilled in the Greeks was a sound dislike toward the Persians. And so Philip of Macedon, he wasn't looking to conquer much more of the area, but rather to maintain where he was. And he actually had 7 wives, and he wasn't a very ambitious man. However, one of Philip of Macedon's wives, Olympia, she was a very ambitious woman. And she saw in one of her children, she saw Alexander had great ambition. And so Alexander, he's about 20 years old at this time. And from history, it's not absolutely ironclad, but it's believed by most historians that Olympia betrays her husband and is party in the assassination of her husband, Philip of Macedon, and Alexander ascending the throne. And so Alexander, he's only about 20 years old when he ascends the throne of Greece, and yet he is extremely ambitious. He is someone who is not satisfied with how the kingdom was actually moving during the time of his dad, but instead he starts strategizing exactly what he's going to do. And so he brings the Macedon army. He bolsters the Macedon army, and just like what this talks about, suddenly a male goat came from the west. He rises suddenly to power because his father is assassinated. He's put into place, and he begins a conquest to take over the known world. That was what was driving him. And within 6 years, he was able to totally take over all of the Persian Empire. In fact, as he actually does this, he begins one of his major. There were 3 major battles that actually happened that cripples the Persians, and the first one is during the last years of Xerxes, around 334. Granicus, he attacks and takes and pushes the Persians out of there. Darius II comes to power, and in November of 333 BC, at the Battle of Issus, he conquers, and it's Darius. He basically runs in the retreat. It's recorded that the Persians ran away and basically leave everything for the Greeks to take. And the last major conquest was in Gaugamela in October of 331, and it was near Nineveh, and basically takes down the rest of the Persian Empire. And he comes into Susa with no resistance whatsoever and takes over. And with that comes the Babylonian Empire, and or what used to be the former Babylonian Empire. And Alexander the Great, he really, really liked Babylon. And so he sets this up as his central command center. In fact, he makes Babylon his capital of the larger empire. Even though it's centered out of Greece, he actually, because of the conquest that he's doing, he sets up a second central area where he's ruling from, which happens to be Babylon. And so he keeps on pushing in for the next 4 years. And for the next 4 years, he keeps on expanding. He expands into Egypt, and he expands further east all the way into India. So he takes the Persian Empire beyond where it was and pushes further east past Iraq, Iran, into where Afghanistan is, and further into even where in India is today, and conquers all of that. And so for all the way from the Mediterranean, which is in the Greek area, where Greece is, and Macedon and Turkey, all the way over to India. This becomes all of Alexander the Great's territory. And at 29, he's basically only ruled for 10 years. At 29, he despairs because basically he's conquered all of what is basically known as the heavily populated area that he's aware of. And he rules for another couple years, and he dies at the age of 32. And so Lysimachus is one of his tutors during this time, and he is very much aware of the desires that Alexander the Great has. And so it's very interesting when we're actually looking at this story that this is a ram. So I forgot to mention that ram is the symbol of Persia. And in fact, when you look through history, Persia, the helmet that was worn by king after king in the Persian Empire was a helmet that resembled ram's horns. And so it's very, very interesting that this is the symbolism that is picked up and given in the vision that Daniel has. And then the other, and also in the zodiac, is that Aries represents Persia in the zodiac. And then when we move on in the zodiac, Capricorn represents Greece. And so it's Macedon, who was the greater area of the Greek Empire when Philip of Macedon was ruling. He established that the goat with a single horn was the symbol of the Macedon Empire. And Alexander, he takes that same symbol on as he continues to conquest. Many of the shields had that symbol on the shields as the Greeks and the Macedons moved forward in the army. So it's very interesting that when we actually look at the symbolism, it's a single goat with a single horn, so it represents one king happening. And then starting in verse 8, it says, "Therefore the male goat grew very great. But when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it, 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven." And so, just like we talked about last week, that when Alexander the Great died, it was actually Lysimachus who came into his chambers as he's dying, and he says, "Who do you want your kingdom to go to?" And he said, "Give it to the strong." And so we talked about last week how that is divided up. Cassander, one of his major generals, he takes the Macedonia, Greece area, and he rules from, and he liked the lavish lifestyle. He liked the lifestyle in the Greek area, in the areas of Greece. And so he didn't really do a whole lot. He just simply took the Western territory and he set himself up as king over that area. Lysimachus, on the other hand, he took Thrace and Bithynia and Asia Minor, basically the area through Greece, through Turkey, from the area of Greece and Macedonia. He took the rest of the area all the way through Turkey. However, those were the 2 smallest areas. It's the next 2 areas that this whole vision begins to focus in on. And so from the area that where Lysimachus, he ends, Seleucus, he takes everything east. And so he takes Syria, he takes what was Persia at the time, Iraq, Afghanistan, all the way into India. He takes all that area. Ptolemy, who is the other major general, so Seleucus and Ptolemy are the two strongest generals, and they take the two largest areas. Ptolemy, he takes the southern section. He takes Egypt and Cyrene, Asia Minor, those types of area. And the two where Seleucus's area and Ptolemy's area meet, it meets right at Judah, where Jerusalem is. And so that becomes the hotly contested area between Seleucus and Ptolemy. And so it's and it says, out of one of them, this is where we come into new territory. Starting at verse 9 in Daniel 8. Up to this point, we've seen all of these symbolisms. We saw the leopard, or the beast that looked like a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads, and we talked about how fast it would actually move. And here the goat is moving so fast it's as if it's not even touching the ground. Again, in a mere 10 years, did Alexander the Great basically conquer the known world. And so, however, in verse 9 begins a brand new narrative, and this narrative is not talking about one of the greatest kings that arises out of the Greek Empire, but it draws attention to the reader specifically because of its implications. So in the Seleucid dynasty, there were several kings that arose. And Antiochus III, also known as Antiochus the Great, he's actually one of the greatest kings that ruled over the Seleucus's area that he had. He's one of the most influential. He actually took some territory from the Ptolemies. He also took some territory from Lysimachus. He is, and that's the reason why he's known as Antiochus the Great. He ruled very powerfully. He was a very good strategist, and but that's not where Scripture pays attention. And so when we're actually looking at where verse 9 starts, is a different ruler. In fact, it's his son who actually that we're going to pay attention to. And so verse 9, it says, and out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land, or the pleasant land. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down because of the transgression. An army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to a certain one who was speaking, how long will this vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of the desolation, and the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, for 2,300 days, and we'll talk about days, and then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. So I don't want you to get confused with this little horn compared to the little horn of the last vision that Daniel had. If you remember, the little horn, the one that of the first vision, came out of the Roman Empire. It was one that rose up in the Roman Empire. Now, the fact that it's a little horn in this one is talking about parallelism. However, as you see, this is a little horn that comes out of the four horns that rise up from the goat. So this is actually saying during the Greek Empire, there's going to arise a ruler who's going to model similar to the one that actually is going to raise up out of the Roman Empire. And so that's what's very important to pay attention. This little horn is specifically one that is going to raise up during the Greek Empire. And very specifically is directly going to affect the Jews in Israel. And that's where it talks about that it's going to affect the glorious land, and it's going to talks about the sacrifices, and it talks about the things that are going to be given over to it. And so starting in verse 15 starts this interpretation. Then it happened when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meeting, that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. So if you remember in the last vision, he was actually taken to heaven, and others were actually seeing the vision and interpreting it. And as you can see what happened in Susa, the same thing is happening there, because he overhears a conversation between two heavenly beings and who come up with this 2300 days. Then, as Daniel is coming out of the vision, he was actually what he'd seen in the vision. Notice this is now past tense. He's coming out of the vision. He actually is pondering it, and there stood before him a person who actually looks like a man. It's not saying it is a man. He has the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, who called and said, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. And so most scholars actually believe that's Jesus actually giving instruction to Gabriel to tell Daniel what the vision means. And so Daniel's actually coming out of the vision, and now there are these two men. These aren't the two men that are in the vision. This is now the vision is done, and there, where he is, Ulai is a canal there, and he's actually saying, oh, I have these two men who are now going to actually give me this understanding. We know Gabriel is an angel. We know that he is one of the archangels, and he's sent with the message to give the interpretation of this vision. And so he came near where I stood. And when he came near, I was afraid and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, Son of Man, the vision refers to a time at the end. And so if you're actually reading in other translations, it was, and you'll see here in verse 18, now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and stood me upright. Now that stood me upright is actually a Hebrew idiom. It doesn't necessarily mean that he put him on his feet. It's very interesting. He starts with understand the vision, but there is no capacity within Daniel to understand what's actually going on. There's no capacity within Daniel to understand the vision until Gabriel touches him, and that stood him upright. It can be referred to as a Hebrew idiom to give the understanding of. In other words, to give the capacity to stand under the understanding. And so, some people say Daniel felt weak. Gabriel touched him. He had the strength to stand. However, it also can very easily also mean he touched him, gave him strength, and helped him to understand what was happening in the vision. And so in 19, and he said, "Look, I am making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation, for the appointed time and the end shall be. The ram which you saw having the two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia, and the male goat is the kingdom of Greece." So it's from this interpretation that Gabriel gives to Daniel that it gives us full understanding of the previous visions that have happened. And the large horn that is between its eyes is its first king, which we know today is Alexander the Great. Doesn't name the king, but it is the king nonetheless. And so it's very interesting that even before Persia comes, Daniel has full understanding that what Persia is actually going to do when it comes in. And this is where Daniel studied scripture and reading Isaiah and reading Jeremiah. He has the understanding that he has a scroll of Isaiah, specifically Isaiah 44. He already has it ready because he already knows that the king of Persia is going to overtake Babylon. He knows it from this vision that he has in 551. This is still 12 years before Persia will take over Babylon. Daniel already knows, though, that the Babylonian Empire isn't forever and that the Persian Empire is going to come in. And it says, "And as for the broken horn and the four that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power." So just like Alexander the Great, he had great influence. He was a master strategist. Alexander the Great, not only was he a master strategist, but he was also a master politician. So he was able to navigate all the political things as well as the strategies for conquering nations and conquering different territory. But on top of that, what happens during Alexander the Great's era is that one of the most important things that he did was force the Greek language on every single territory that he took over. And so this is, and we talked about this the last time, that when he actually moved into the different areas, he went ahead and left. They could actually speak the language that they wanted. However, the language of trade had to be done in Greek. And so everyone in all the territories, from Greece all the way to India, all of them, there was only one language that could be used for trade and for moving merchandise between the territory. And it was Greek, and it was only Greek. And so that's why we know at the time of Jesus, every merchant, the language of merchandise was Greek. It wasn't Latin, it was Greek. And it's also really interesting, during the time of the 4 kingdoms is when the Septuagint was translated. And that is the Old Testament was translated into Greek. And so this was something very significant that happened during the time of Ptolemy and Seleucid. It was Ptolemy who had that translation done and having the Bible put into, or the Old Covenant, the Talmud, put into Greek. And so as we read on, it says, verse 23, "And in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully, and he shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. Through his cunning, verse 25, through his cunning he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule, and he shall exalt himself in his heart. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without human means. And the vision of the evenings and mornings which was told is true. Therefore, seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. And so what's interesting in this, as he gives the interpretation, we now can look retrospectively and see who this was. And in fact, when Antiochus the Fourth comes into rule, it was recognized that this was the man. And in fact, we're going to see when we get into Daniel 9, Daniel 10, it's going to talk about the abomination of desolation. And every Jew of the day thought that Antiochus the Fourth is the one who actually fulfilled the abomination of desolation. But we're going to see that Jesus redefines that. Jesus is the one who takes this vision in Daniel 8. He conflates it with Daniel 7 and actually says Daniel 8 is a type and shadow of what will happen, what was talked about in Daniel 7. And then we're going to see in Daniel 9, 10, 11, and 12 further information, and we're going to see, even as they give way more detail about Antiochus the Fourth, you're going to see that it switches between Antiochus the Fourth and the Antichrist. And then it's going to switch back to Antiochus the Fourth and then switch to the Antichrist. It's because both of them are like the little horn that speaks blasphemous words. And the first major type and shadow that is actually shown is here, that in Daniel's vision is this new ruler that's going to come up during the Greek Empire. And we know that this person is Antiochus the Fourth. Antiochus, he also decided to rename himself. His father was known as Antiochus the Great. He actually is not the true successor. He has a brother who is really the successor. And however, when he actually, his brother comes to rule, he actually is murdered. And Antiochus the Fourth, he through negotiating things with Rome, because Rome is actually coming on the scene and is growing in power during this period of time. The true ruler who's supposed to come, he is actually in prison in Rome. And so Antiochus the Fourth, he actually goes and negotiates and buys his way into getting the rulership of the Seleucid area, and specifically in Jerusalem. And so, and he basically comes to power in 175 BC. One of the first things that he does is he goes and invades into the Ptolemy area, into the Ptolemies. And as we talked about before, the Ptolemies were there in the south. The main contingent area was in Jerusalem and in the Judea area. But he pushes all the way down into Egypt, and he goes into Egypt and he defeats Ptolemy the Sixth, and basically establishes his throne in Egypt. Well, Rome didn't like that. He basically, Antiochus, he was actually gaining too much power, and the power that Rome starts exerting, they were like, no, you can't stay in Rome, can't stay in Egypt. And so after defeating Ptolemy, Antiochus IV, he decides, okay, I'm not strong enough to take on Rome. I'm strong enough to keep them out, but I'm not strong enough to take on Rome right now. So he actually moves his center back up into the Judean area. And he's recalled by Egypt, recalled from Egypt by Rome. And basically he makes Jerusalem and the Judea area a buffer area so that Rome doesn't come in and take his territory and push on into the territory that goes further all the way to India. And so, when this happens, he takes the priest in Jerusalem and he deposes the actual Levitical priest. And when he does this, he begins calling himself Epiphanes. And so you'll hear him called Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus Epiphanes IV, Antiochus IV, known as Epiphanes. But he takes on that title himself that means the illustrious one. However, the Jews, they didn't like Antiochus, not at all, because he was a wicked, wicked man. And so they called him Epimanes, which is a play on words for calling him a madman. So they basically, to his face, called him Antiochus Epimanes, and basically calling him a madman to his face. But he basically, through a whole bunch of intrigue, he deposes the priest. He puts a new priest in power, and then his brother, he puts Jason into power in the temple, and then his brother Melanias, he actually deposes him, pays a bigger bribe than what Jason actually paid. And then Antiochus, he goes to check his territory out east, and there's rumor that he dies. And so Jason, he decides he's going to try a coup. And so he starts to actually try to take over in the Jerusalem area, and he totally miscalculated because Antiochus shows up that week and he actually just wipes out. And in his anger, he actually wipes out lots of what's happened in Jerusalem. And he then basically says, I cannot tolerate Jewish customs along with Greek customs. I need to convert all these Jews to be good Greeks. And so basically what he does is he outlaws Judaism. And totally, and so some of the things we see, especially we read it in First Maccabees, some of the laws that he instituted in Jerusalem is just maniacal. So he basically ordered them to follow the Greek customs, things that they weren't used to following. He forbade them to burn offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the temple. Then he also began to profane the Sabbaths and the feasts. And then to take it even further, he defiled the sanctuary. And this is what we're going to talk about, is the abomination of desolation. And this happens December 14th, 168. He replaces the Jewish altar with an altar of Zeus, and right there in the temple sacrifices a pig on the altar of Zeus. And this was just pushed the Jews right over the edge. And so he sacrificed swine and unclean animals. He made it intentional to do that in the temple. And the last order was that they were not allowed to circumcise their sons. As you knew, they would bring their sons to the temple to actually perform the rite of circumcision. Well, what happens is they stop bringing them to the temple to circumcise, but they still, in rebellion against Antiochus, they continue still to circumcise their sons. They just don't bring him to the temple. But all of the takeover that happened, he started it specifically on a Sabbath. In 171, he started it on a Sabbath. He brings 20,000 troops in to actually take it over, and it was Judas Maccabeus, who actually takes the Jewish army, and they flee to the hills. And so it's all during this time. They wanted to, basically what Antiochus wanted to do was make it themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so that they would forget the laws of God. And basically, he issued the order that says, whoever does not obey the command of the king shall die. So in other words, if where they were actually in secret circumcising their sons, if he found out that one of the newborn boys was circumcised, he'd wipe out the whole family. He'd bring the whole family in, and he would kill them all. And so he was a very, very wicked king. And so this goes on for after the sacrifice was actually established in the temple in December 14th, 168. It was 3 years to the day that the sacrifices, the abomination actually continued on. But in December 14th of 165, the temple is actually reclaimed. Antiochus, he's out east, and he's, because of a rumor, and we'll talk way more about that when we get into Daniel 10 and 11. By a rumor, he goes out east to make sure that he is keeping his territory. And as he is traveling, then word it gets to him that the Jews have rebelled. They've taken over the temple. He determines way out east, and think it took several months for the message to actually get to him. He determines then that he is, once he's secured his area out east, he is going to come in and basically wipe out the Jews. He's like, I'm done with them. I'm going to actually wipe them out. I'm going to get rid of them. And it's actually in 163, early in 163, he gets extremely sick. He goes mad, and he actually bursts forth, consumed by an infection and worms. He actually dies on his way back to Jerusalem. And so, but in December 14th, 165, this is when they cleanse the temple. They take out all the images of Zeus and or Jupiter, whichever one you want to call it. And they cleanse out the temple, and they reestablish worship. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what happens with that when we talk about the abomination of desolation. But this is why Hanukkah is celebrated, is because of the cleansing of the temple that happened in 165. So the last thing I want to talk about before I close down is this 2300 days. So that word days actually isn't specifically the days that we see in Hebrew that we see in the creation account. Instead, it's actually the words evenings and mornings. And so as it's gone through translators, different translators have translated it, and because it's evenings and mornings, knowing that it's a day basically is the evening and morning, makes the day, but they basically conflate evenings and mornings to represent a whole day. We're not really sure whether it means days, or if when you talk about evenings and mornings, those are the times of this daily sacrifice. Specifically because it says that the daily sacrifice will be abolished for 2,300 evenings and mornings. Well, you have the evening sacrifice, then you have the morning sacrifice. So scholars argue about this. No one knows definitively what it means, whether it's 2,300 days or if it's 2,300 sacrifices. And I'm actually in the camp of believing that it's 2,300 sacrifices, because that would mean that's 1,150 days. And so when you take 1,150 days, you're really close to that 3-year period that the sacrifice was gone. But if you could take the whole 2,300 days from the time that Antiochus invaded Jerusalem all the way until the temple is cleansed and Antiochus actually dies. So you can take that period and make it 2,300 days. And so that's the reason why we don't know which of the two it actually refers to. However, your type and shadow gets really, really close, or becomes closer to the 3.5 years when we actually talk about evenings and mornings. And the very fact that Antiochus is a type and shadow of Antichrist. And we're going to go into the types and shadows of how Antiochus Epiphanes is like the Antichrist in future lives that we do. So anyway, what's most interesting is that Daniel's instructed to seal up this vision. And what's interesting is, similar to the other vision, if you remember how Daniel records the vision, he summarizes, basically gives the highlights of what he's actually seeing. And so it's very interesting. And again, when we start comparing this to Revelation 13 and other things in Revelation, you can see that this revelation can grow much, much larger. And we know from the vision that he had in Daniel 7, he records the highlights, but there were way more details, especially when he started asking questions. There are way, way more details of what was actually happening in the vision, because, as you know, a picture's worth 1,000 words. And so there's way, way more going on in this vision. But Gabriel basically says, you need to seal this up. This is for the future. This is for a time that's yet to come. And then this ends, verse 27, and it says, I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. And this is one of the interesting things, is that the weight of this vision that he has and its direct impact on Jerusalem and worship in Jerusalem, the sacrificial system, all of that weighs really, really heavy on Daniel. And this isn't one of those things that, with this kind of vision, that you take lightly. Even though he's told to seal it up, he's experienced all of it. He experienced the full impact of it. It started making, and the very fact of the revelation of heavenly beings even coming to him have made him weak. And then the impact of the full vision also has made him weak. And so when the vision is over, he totally passes out. He loses consciousness. And then as he's considering what this vision is, it has physically made him ill for days. And it's interesting. Then it says, and afterward I arose and went about the king's business. And so that also gives us a very interesting insight to what Daniel was actually doing. Daniel would have been in his late 60s at this time. And as you can see, even though Belshazzar doesn't know Daniel, Daniel's about the king's business. He's actually doing things for the kingdom of Babylon, and the king isn't even aware that he's doing these things. And so it's just really, really interesting, an interesting insight as to what Daniel's actually doing during, and this is 551 BC. And so anyway, but it says, I was astonished, and that's like without any strength, without any words, by the vision, but no one understood it. And so it's really, really interesting. It's after all these years and looking retrospect that we see into this vision at least a little bit, but we don't have a full understanding even today as we look into it, just because of how this vision, as well as the vision that happened in 553, and then the future visions that we're getting ready to talk about, how they all overlap, how they actually talk about what was about to come in the near future versus also what was to come in the far future. And so this is what makes Daniel such an amazing book, is that the visions that are actually given, these from 8 forward, directly impact Israel, directly impact Judah, directly impact the Jews. But as we see from Daniel 7, the vision in Daniel 7 is written in Aramaic, so we know that the reign of the Antichrist also has an impact on the Greek world or the Gentile world, just like it's going to have an impact on the Jewish world. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in the future lives that we're going to do with Daniel. So I just want to thank you for joining me today as we talked about Daniel 8.